My name is Dr. George Ndemo, and I welcome you to this presentation this afternoon. We are talking on why self-knowledge is the true foundation of science and philosophy. First and foremost, I am deeply grateful to the Bonaventures for inviting me to be a guest speaker in the 47th episode of your public symposium. I also extend my heartfelt congratulations on the remarkable evolution of your group from CAP scholars to in-learners, then to PINL, that is platform for inspired learners, and now to Bonaventures. This ongoing transformation is a testament to your commitment to growth, learning, and intellectual engagement. In the past, I have also had the opportunity to give two presentations to your group. One on the contemporary link between philosophy and theology, and another on using science to test philosophical beliefs about the good life. The question I would like to address today in this 47th episode is why self-knowledge is the true foundation of science and philosophy. And to begin with, I think the first question that arises with regard to the topic, self-knowledge and the true foundation of science and philosophy, is what is the good of it? I will argue that its value is not merely negative, but also that the discovery and articulation of its positive function calls for originality and creativity. So first I will begin with a merely negative conception of the value of knowledge. The simplest way to approach the question of the value of self-knowledge might be by analogy with Herbert Butterfield's perspective on the value of history. Butterfield, a distinguished English historian, known for revising prior interpretations of English history, addresses this in his History and Human Relations. There he considers whether it would make any practical difference if people knew no history at all. His answer is striking. People could probably manage their public and private affairs just as well as they do now, even without any knowledge of history. However, Butterfield adds an important qualification. The really issue, he argues, is not the absence of history, but the presence of bad history, distorted, misleading, or harmful interpretations that have disastrous effects in all directions. This, he claims, gives history its greatest practical importance. Bad history must be replaced with good history. In a similar vein, one could propose a merely negative conception of the value of self-knowledge. Perhaps its value lies not in offering great insights or profound transformations, but simply in correcting false beliefs and uprooting misleading self-conceptions. If so, The role of self-knowledge would be to pull up the weeds, to remove harmful errors, rather than plant new truths. And perhaps we would expect no more of it than that. But to speak of self-knowledge as true foundation of science and philosophy would be to say that the subject is not a mere passive receiver of objective truths, but as a mediator between the objective world and subjective experience. Now, this will give a priority to the subject in foundationalism, and would thus underscore the subjective nature of epistemic access to foundational truths. If so, then, the priority of the subject in foundationalism raises the issue of relativism. If the ability to recognize foundational truths is contingent upon the subject's perspective, which, as we know, is shaped by personal, educational, cultural, emotional, or psychological state or historical factors, then it becomes difficult to assert the universal validity of foundational principles. Now, in this sense, foundationalism risks becoming relativistic, as the objective foundations of knowledge might be inaccessible or differently interpreted by different subjects. This creates a dilemma. While foundationalism asserts the existence of objective, self-evident truths, the priority of the subject can create a gap between the objectivity of the truth and the subjectivity of the knower. The subjective condition of the knower means that what is objectively true may not be universally or immediately accessible, leading to discrepancies in how foundational truths are understood. Now, the challenge then is that while foundationalism seeks to establish objective principles as the basis of knowledge, it also relies on subjective factors to ensure that these principles are perceived and accepted. Now, this dual reliance on both objective foundations and the subject's subjective capacities creates a potential gap in the process of knowing and knowing what is truly foundational. Now, let's look at the subject as a mediator. Given this tension, we can view the subject not as a mere passive receiver of objective truths, but as a mediator between the objective world and the subjective experience. The subject's cognitive structures, beliefs, and wisdom shape how they interpret and understand foundational principles. Thus, foundational knowledge is not just about uncovering external truths, but also about transforming the subject through education, experience, and reflection, so that they are capable of seeing these truths. Now, this brings me to my second point. And the second point I want to look at is the influence of phenomenology on self-knowledge. Phenomenology challenges traditional foundations of the sciences by emphasizing the central role of human subjectivity in all forms of knowledge. Whether in the human sciences or natural sciences, it insists that scientific inquiry is always rooted in a lived, experienced world where both the subject and the object of study are intertwined. Phenomenology uncovers what is often called the existential gap, the discrepancy between a person's lived experience and their understanding of that experience. And we will see the same raised again in quantum mechanics. In the context of the sciences, this gap highlights the limitations of purely objective or scientific accounts of human beings. It suggests that the full depth of human existence cannot be captured through empirical methods alone. The existential gap in foundations refers to the distinction between the objective or rational foundations of knowledge and the subjective or personal experience that shapes individual understanding. Both Brentano and Husserl were reacting to the naturalistic application of science to the study of cognition. They had no objection to the use of science, but to the particular area to which its use was being put. The naturalists who attempted to reduce philosophy to science focused on the non-intentional elements in cognition, those non-intentional sensations causally produced through interactive physical stimulations. Michael McCarthy points out that they were working in the Humean tradition, which he summarizes well. That Hume reduced the intentional consciousness to a temporal succession of one-dimensional psychic states, which he called perceptions. These unit states of awareness were isolated from any structural reference to an object beyond themselves. They were simply non-intentional occurrences occupying a temporal position within a single stream of consciousness. Now, the naturalists focused on the physical and the physiological activities of the human brain, measuring whatever is observable and quantifiable. In Leipzig, Husserl had worked with Wundt, the father of modern experimental psychology, which emphasizes neuroscience. The attempt to naturalize cognition and especially epistemology was, in the judgment of Michael McCarthy, a colossal blunder. Basically, it failed to distinguish what differentiates philosophy from science. It failed to distinguish the intentional from the non-intentional. And in the judgment of Brentano and Husserl, it failed to conceive and target the appropriate subject matter of philosophy. It ignored the fact that the core sources, acts, terms, and the norms of cognition are all inherently intentional. It ended up as psychologism, the attempted reduction of authentic philosophical disciplines to the non-intentional psychology of sensation. So what then is meant by intentionality? Husserl, following Brentano, called attention to the fact that an examination of consciousness reveals that conscious, active experience is intentional. Consciousness, like a transitive verb, is transitive. It takes the accusative. It intends an object. It stretches out toward an object in the root meaning of the verb intend. Consciousness is a dynamism with a from to orientation, from the conscious subject to the object, from the intending subject to the intended object. So one of his basic ideas is that conscious experience is intentional in nature, always having both a subject and object pole. Husserl called the act of intending noesis and the thing intended nema. And so Lonergan agrees that Husserl, by his painstaking analysis of intentionality, made it evident that human thinking and judging are not just non-intentional psychological events, as Hume had supposed, but always and intrinsically intend, refer to, mean objects distinct from themselves. This is how phenomenology challenged the traditional foundations of the sciences, emphasizing the central role of human subjectivity in all forms of knowledge. Now, Michael McCarthy, in his book, The Crisis of Philosophy, has admirably traced the development of the turn to the subject and how they eventuated in logical positivism and phenomenology. He says, with Descartes, we see the shift of modern philosophy from the object to the subject, indeed to the human subject as thinker, chooser, and doer. Descartes shifted the target of philosophical inquiry from the principles of being to the principles of knowledge. He sought to establish an unquestionable base of truths on which one could logically deduce the rest of what could be known. Hume countered with the claim that the best science is the science of man, within whose cognizance all other sciences lie, and upon whose powers and the faculties of judgment they depend. The first target of inquiry, he argued, should rather be the inquiring subject. So the empiricists who followed Hume eventually reduced the cognitive subject to a bundle of impressions and ideas, period. Now Gottlieb Frege, the most important philosopher of mathematics in the 19th century and the grandfather of logical positivism, in turn, criticized the empiricists and limited the search for a basis of knowledge to the analysis and the reconstruction of the propositional structures of science. Philosophy, for him, became the logical analysis of thoughts. And the thoughts, in his theory, serve two interrelated functions. Semantically, they are the sense or meaning expressed by indicative sentences. Epistemically, they are the intentional content apprehended or grasped in acts of understanding and judgment. The realm of thoughts, for Frege, is made up of propositional terms of meaning, such as the Pythagorean theorem, the second law of thermodynamics, or the principle of the excluded middle. According to Frege and the early Wittgenstein, accordingly, Frege and the early Wittgenstein concentrated their attention on the expression and the terms of meaning. Their effort has undeniable merit in Marquardt's judgment, but suffers from one major flaw. That is the neglect of any theory of cognitional performance. Brentano and Husserl supplied for this neglect by descriptive psychology and phenomenology, seeking the sources of the logical products of mental activity in their cognitive acts. But their consequent failure to clear up the precise relationship between the transcendental ego and the finite, factually intentional subject of inquiring triggered a strong reaction from the naturalistic philosophers who claimed that all philosophy of the mind can be reduced to its physical and measurable components in the brain. This new wave of naturalistic philosophy linked the analytical progress of logical analysis with the behavioral approach to cognitive psychology. Its influence was pervasive. It preserved Frege's interest in the logical structure of science, but rejected his search for the invariant conceptual foundations of that structure. It sustained Dewey's interest in a behavioral theory of inquiry, but identified the best cognitive operations with forms of linguistic activity. McCarthy points out that the foundational principles of contemporary naturalism are distinctively methodological. Thus, contemporary naturalist philosophers restrict legitimate theoretical inquiry about cognition to the intersubjective evidential base of language or behavior. Indeed, their intent was to model philosophical reflection on the canonical methods of empirical science. The result was that naturalism restored the cognitive subject to the domain of surveyable fact, but neglected the full reality of the subject's intentional consciousness. Now, to return to our story on foundations and self-knowledge. Now, foundations in a philosophical sense provide the base upon which further knowledge and inquiry can be built. However, the existential gap highlights the challenge that foundational principles or truths, while necessary for constructing a coherent system of thought, are often incomplete when it comes to addressing the human condition. And so Lonergan notes that modern philosophers have passed from logic to method and have developed methods that are distinctive of their own disciplines, but have failed to come up with a higher discipline which could explain their respective methods for them. So what this means is that at one stage, the initial stage, logic provided the foundations for science. But then logic was gradually displaced by method in the scientific revolution. And so it ceased being the foundation for sciences, and instead it was replaced by method. So method became the measure of all sciences. Now, with the publication of Insights, Lonergan attempted to supply the failure that the sciences could not meet. In this sense, traditional and modern responses to the question of the foundations of science and philosophy have proven inadequate. To fully appreciate how contemporary foundations across various disciplines have developed and how they continue to adopt, it's essential to understand the historical context in which these foundations emerged. And now I turn to the revolutions in the concept of foundations. The concept of foundations in philosophy, science, and mathematics typically refers to the underlying principles or truths that serve as the base upon which further knowledge is built. The foundations of the sciences traditionally concerns the epistemological and ontological questions about the nature and scope of knowledge, as well as the methods through which knowledge is acquired. This foundational role is generally thought to offer a stable and objective grounding for knowledge systems. However, a key issue arises when considering the relationship between these foundations and the subjectivity of the individual knower. Furthermore, history reveals a dialectic of foundations in either philosophy, science, or mathematics, where the notion of foundational principles evolves in response to intellectual challenges and shifts in the understanding of knowledge. In each domain, foundationalism has undergone transformations from the search for self-evident principles in classical philosophy to the more abstract and theoretical foundations in modern science and mathematics. This dialectic exposes a fundamental tension between the desire for objective certainty and the subjectivity of the knower's perspective, raising critical questions about the nature and accessibility of foundational truths. In philosophy, foundationalism initially sought universal self-evident principles, but was increasingly challenged by the relativistic and contextual approaches that emphasized the role of individual subjectivity, culture, and perspective in shaping foundational beliefs. So the idea was that while most philosophical domains were a jungle of conflicting ideas, logic offered a secure and universally accepted foundation. This perception of logic as an uncontroversial and scientific discipline led to the belief that mathematics too should be based on a more general and universally agreed upon foundation logic. And this led to what in modern contemporary times we see mathematics being more and more of logic and logic being more and more of mathematics. Thus, mathematicians sought to root their science in logic, aiming to create a unified and rigorous basis for mathematical reasoning. The development of mathematical logic has significantly transformed our understanding and application of logic. We are no longer in the same intellectual position as we were in the past, whether in the time of the Greeks, the medieval period, or even a few decades ago. This shift is due to the emergence of a new complex of logical techniques that have reshaped the landscape of logic itself, as found in symbolic logic or formal logic. Now, in science and mathematics, foundational questions have emerged regarding the logical or empirical certainty of foundational principles, especially in light of advancements in quantum theory, chaos theory, or the principle of, also known as the principle of uncertainty, and non-Euclidean geometry. The tension between the objectivity of foundational knowledge and the subjectivity of the knower has led to the need for new paradigms, such as constructivism or pragmatism, which challenge traditional foundationalist claims of universally applicable truths. The problem lies in reconciling the historical evolution of foundationalism with the ongoing challenges to its assumptions about objectivity and universality. How can we understand foundational principles that claim to be universally valid when they must be interpreted through the lenses of subjective experience and historical context? This dialectical foundations across different intellectual traditions invites further investigations into how historical shifts, subjective experiences, and epistemic limitations shape the very idea of what can be considered foundational in knowledge. Scientists, while adept with their own specialized fields, face a significant limitation when it comes to providing a comprehensive account of the foundations of science itself. The nature of scientific inquiry cannot in itself offer a final, all-encompassing understanding of its own foundations. In other words, science may ultimately be regarded as either a legitimate pursuit or a superstition, depending on the philosophical framework that underpins it. The level of philosophical understanding an individual possesses can greatly affect the validity and interpretation of scientific claims. Now, today, it is being realized that science is actually a human activity. And I turn my attention now to science as a human activity. Now, many scientists make the mistake of confusing the definition of modern science with the assumptions upon which it is based. They believe that any knowledge system which does not account for these assumptions must not be in the realm of science. According to the worldview of reductionist science, scientific reality is perceived objectively without the participation of the observer. There is no recognition for the scientific reality of the human inner life. Scientific methodology is therefore based on the assumption that the process of observation involves the detachment of the observer. Of great significance in the Western tradition, this quality of detachment from the objective world is the origin of the concept of individuality and individual freedom. The price has been a sense of alienation from the outer world, a loss of the sense of oneness with the universe, a loss of the holistic perspective which Husserl was concerned with. In the extreme form of detachment, the individual treats other human beings as objects. But the truth that is realized now is that science is a human activity. Scientists make models of the physical world. On the basis of certain metaphysical assumptions, they design experiments to test their models. Using guidelines formulated with the framework of a given value system, mark you, a given value system, they carry out experiments to test their models. The metaphysical assumptions which form the foundation of modern science, also known as logical empiricism, include, among others, one, that the observer and the observed are separate entities, and that gives us the theory of objectivism as the foundation of sciences. There is another one, that complex phenomena can be explained in terms of simple phenomena, and that gives us the theory of reductionism. There is another one, that all scientific knowledge can be derived from physically measurable data, and that gives us positivism. And there is also another one, that it is possible to predict phenomena on the basis of scientific laws, and that gives us the theory of determinism. Now, these assumptions have become so well established that many scientists make the mistake of confusing them with the definition of modern science. They believe that any knowledge system that does not account for these assumptions must not be in the realm of science. And this gets its roots from Auguste Comte. And so I would like to say something about positivism and Auguste Comte. Now, Auguste Comte, associated with the beginnings of the positivist movement, was born in Montpellier in 1978. He idolized Benjamin Franklin and called him the modern Socrates. He held the idea that social, like physical phenomena, might be explained by scientific rationality, and that one of the functions of philosophy or philosophical thought should be to contribute ideas for the resolution of moral and political problems of mankind. He wrote the 5-volume work entitled Positive Philosophy and a 4-volume work entitled Positive Polity. He classified the sciences in the order in which the scientific method was applied to the study of the subject matter. So at the top was mathematics, astronomy, physics, chemistry, biology, and then sociology. Now, historians could see 3 stages of development in his theory. At first, the subject was conceived in terms of problems explained by the will of some deity, that's the will of God, and this formed what he called the theological perception. Next, the subject was conceived in terms of problems explained by metaphysical abstractions. This is the example given by Plato's ideas, Hegel's absolute idea. Stars moved in circles because circles were the most perfect figure. And finally, the subject was conceived in terms of problems explained by precise observation, hypothesis, and experiment. And this is now the positive science. So the scientific method was applied in the study of problems which were then explained in terms of scientific theories and laws, describing the regularities of natural cause and effect. Comte said that it was time for philosophers to abandon metaphysics and look to science. That philosophy was not different from science, but was the coordination of the sciences, and its function was to improve human life. This was positivism. We see its rampant implications in education, and because of time, let me escape the section of its implication into education. Now, I look at the early 20th century. By the early 20th century, relativity and quantum theory cast doubt over whether or to what extent a scientist is separate from what he observes, and hence raised questions about the meaning of objectivity. So as a theory-making process defined by Bacon and applied by Newton, induction was effective within the philosophical framework of determinism. That is, matter is governed by determinate laws of cause and effect. Now, Einstein changed the concept of matter as a substance, and he called matter a highly packaged energy, which is defined by the formula E equals mc squared. So the concept of matter as substance was changed by that formula, or with that formula. So matter as transformable energy was conceived as a process. So now matter was no longer seen as a substance, but it was seen, or it was conceived as a process. So the universe is not a collection of things so much as an interacting set of events or processes. Albert Einstein received the Nobel Prize in 1921 for the work describing his theory of the quantum nature of light to explain the properties of light in the context of the discontinuous basic structures of nature. Planck had described how energy is absorbed and emitted in packets called quanta. Einstein demonstrated how light energy is absorbed and emitted in packets called photons. Each photon of a given color has a certain frequency and thus a certain amount of energy. Photons of high frequency light have more energy than photons of low frequency light. He proved his theory with an experiment demonstrating the phenomenon known as the photoelectric effect. But subatomic events described by the new quantum theory were shown to be determined not by mechanistic laws, but by laws of probability. So in quantum theory, individual events do not always have a well-defined cause. For example, the jump of an electron from one atomic orbit to another, or the disintegration of a subatomic particle may occur spontaneously without any single event causing it. So we can never predict when and how such a phenomenon is going to happen. We can only predict its probability. So what is important here is that the laws of atomic physics were seen as statistical laws according to which the probabilities for atom events are determined by the dynamics of the whole system. So whereas in classical mechanics the properties and the behavior of the parts determine those of the whole, the situation is reversed in quantum mechanics. It is the whole that determines the behavior of the parts. So observers of nature, the working scientists, required a new philosophical framework and an appropriate theory making process. The quantum revolution was so cataclysmic because it attacked not one or two conclusions of classical physics, but its very cornerstone, the foundation upon which the whole edifice was erected, and that was the subject-object dualism. It was abundantly clear to these physicists that objective measurements and verification could no longer be the mark of absolute reality, because the measured object could never be completely separated from the measuring subject. The measure and the measure the measure and the measurer, the verified and the verifier. At this level, they are one and the same. And this is what prompts me to drive to the subject as the foundation. So the self-awareness as the foundation of the foundations of science. So the story of science as a human activity brings us to the deeply persisting and troubling standoff between philosophy and science based on cultural worldview of reality. In it, one can see a battle for precision and critical character, and what is more, an explicit growth of that precision and critical character over the centuries. Philosophy put the practice of poetry into question. Science put the practice of philosophy into question, and now philosophy puts the practice of science into question. From the cultural point of view, it's a movement from mythical culture to philosophical, religious, theological, and scientific cultural worldview. The question is, from there, what might come out next? Now we know that each science ultimately rests on a foundation it did not itself establish. The search for foundations of philosophy and science can be most clearly understood by examining the relationship between the two, not only in terms of their affinities, but also their tensions. So philosophy proposes logical methods as the foundation for our search, for foundation of the sciences. Science proposes methods as the foundations. So given that, the question arises, because the origins of science lie in a theoretical question about science itself, no particular science, when considered in isolation, can direct us to the source of this foundational inquiry. Each science ultimately rests on a foundation it did not itself establish. This foundation is what makes the existence of the science possible in the first place. The principle by which we answer questions about the theory of science must be the same in all courses. Now, if behind the plurality of the sciences there were a corresponding multiplicity of heterogeneous foundational principles, we would lose the unity of the thinking and acting subject. A unity that is not only presupposed but continuously experienced. Now this implies that the foundation of the sciences as provided by the theory of science must itself be one. And Aristotle realized this when he said metaphysics provides us with that foundation. Now, given the multiplicity of the sciences, where can scholars from such diverse fields find a common language that allows them to see their disciplines not as isolated silos of information, but simply as different facets of a larger unfolding truth that encompasses all our knowledge, be it of God, be it of creation, be it of humankind? Now, Bernard Lonergan, a little known philosopher and theologian, gives us a methodology which provides just that sort of conceptual common ground of understanding of understanding. And he says in a nutshell, this will be self-appropriation. And by self-appropriation is what we mean by self-awareness. And with that, let me just bring my presentation to the end. That this is what I meant by saying that once all the other approaches have failed, an alternative view is the one that suggests that we find this foundation in the subject. And the subject gets this through self-appropriation, self-awareness. Now, time does not allow me to expound how this takes place, and I didn't intend to give that. Maybe in another forum, I will explain how the proponents of consciousness explain the subject as the foundation of the sciences. Today, I wanted to explain why we are moving to the subject as the foundation of science. And I guess I have shown this by simply saying that the first approach of having logic as the foundation failed. It was displaced by method. Now method got its own challenges. We got a variation of methods. Not a single one has been able to give us a common ground. And so an alternative view has come up. The alternative view is having the subject as the foundation.
Okay, thank you very much, Doctor, for the wonderful presentation. It was very good and systematic. You talked about the way self-knowledge, the foundation of science, but also philosophy, and you dealt with the methodological approach to which founding the foundation. It looks like the key word in your title was that the word foundation. It seems to me, because you are trying to look for the foundations of science and philosophy. I received one question from people when I was sharing the title. I shared the title in one group, and some reactions came, and at least one question was the first one. Now I'd like to share that one. Yeah, I would perhaps like to share the response. This one was trying to be simple and trying to go to the very first word in the title. Self-knowledge. And he asked in Kiswahili, so I will ask if you can try to see that in both in English or somehow in Kiswahili. Kujielewa ni nini? Mtu anayejielewa yukoje? What is self-awareness? Or self-awareness, or self-awareness, self-knowledge, I don't know. And how can we say this man is self-aware, is aware of himself? He has self-knowledge. How can we say this man has self-awareness? Are there qualities? Maybe before we got the methodologies, you can try to check out that.
Thank you. A good question, and it's exactly what I could anticipate from anybody who listens to this. As I said, I did not go, nor did I intend to go beyond suggesting why the subject is the foundation. Because going to that would have needed to explain how the subject then makes the foundation. But so I hinted that it's by self-awareness. One time when an opportunity arises, I may want to explore that further, and explain it in more details. But to simplify it, self-awareness means becoming aware of the process that one will go through, to acquire knowledge. So it's not just enough to have knowledge, but it is knowing the process that we undergo to acquire the knowledge. Now, getting that and using it yourself makes you very comfortable, because then you can be able to see what is wrong where. Now, more than that, what is meant by this is that this self-aware person understands that knowledge does not come as a one activity, that there are multiple operations that we perform to get this knowledge. But these operations are performed in our minds. The operations are not of the same quality. They are not of the same weight. I think weight will be the best term here. They are not of the same weight. Some are clumsy. Some are serious. Others are rigorous. Just as an example, we see, we perceive. We see, we perceive. But seeing is not a very serious. It's not a very serious activity that we perform, and perceiving is not a very serious activity. But seriousness comes in when you begin asking, what is this that I have seen? What is this that you have seen? The eyes just see, and that is it. And that is it. Their story ends there. But you become serious when you ask, what is it that I have seen? Now, asking what is it that you have seen requires you to be a little serious, not clumsy, to be a little serious. Because then you will begin an inquiry. That inquiry will take you through so many processes. If it requires you to read, you will read. If it requires you to carry an interview, you will carry an interview. If it requires you to make an experiment, you will make an experiment. And finally, when you grasp that which you were looking for, you can smile and dance, jump like Archimedes. Archimedes is this Greek philosopher who was asked by the king to find out whether the gift of a crown that he had been given was purely of gold or he had been duped. Archimedes now did not know how to establish, how can he ascertain that this crown is purely of gold. It troubled him. And while he kept thinking about it, so at one time when he was just taking a bath in the public bath places, he discovered one thing, that when he jumps into the basin of the water, he displaces the amount of water. So the level of the water rises. When he gets out, the level goes down. So he realized, kumbe, you displace the same volume of water as the volume of your body. So he said, Eureka, I have found it. So that is exactly now what we could have done with that. It just needed to get a same amount of gold like the one he had, puts it in the water, he tests it, and then puts the crown the same. If they don't displace the same volume, then the king has been duped. That's why he danced that he had found it. So that's what happens when we get that insight. So today they call it an insight. That grasp, they call it an insight. And it's given the name understanding. At one point, it was assumed that understanding was knowing. Now today, understanding is not considered as knowledge or the whole of knowledge, but it is a part of knowledge, just a small part of knowledge, because there is more to that. So once you have grasped what you are looking for, people will ask you, what is it that you have gotten? And then you will be required to tell us what you have understood. Has it ever happened to you that you understand something and then when asked to explain it, you can't explain?
Yes.
So what exactly happens? Because it's one thing to have that in the mind. So it is in the mind in form of an idea. But for it to be brought out, you need a word to replace the idea. And so when you get the word, now we call it a concept. Although some people confuse concept and idea, they use them as synonymous. Really, a concept is a verbal expression of an idea. When it has not been given a word, it is in the mind, it is an idea. When we get a word to stand for it, then we call it a concept. Now, words are not given naturally. We create as human beings. So the English people would call this water, the Latin people would call it aqua, the Swahili people would call it maji. If you see what is happening is that they are playing with the letters, which in language we are told is the foundation of language. So you play around with the letters, you put them together and they form them. So this is what happens, that you go through that process. Now once you get it, you end up now in defining. But then still there is more to that. When you understand, the mind doesn't settle there. The mind asks the question, is it so? Is it so? How many stories have you been told and you have taken them for granted without asking whether they are true? Now, when you ask that question, is it true? Here, for you to get an answer, you will not only be serious, but you will be rigorous. So you will be double serious than before. Now, this is the process that it takes us through. So the bottom of it all is that we become attentive. Now, it is the person who understands that our mind operates in this way that we are calling a person that is self-aware. And this is what self-knowledge means about. It's not knowing when I was born and who are my parents, no, but it is getting that awareness of how the mind operates and being able to use it. The beauty of it all is that now you come to understand that kumbe, there are people who stop at the first level of operations where we are not serious. And so we will get people like the positivists, the empiricists. And then there are others who realize that that is not enough. And the science, when it became serious, realized that it is not enough to make observations and perform experiments, but you need to explain. So they said there must be a theory behind that. Now we moved from just seeing to forming a theory, that there must be an explanation behind everything that we see. And this calls for the theory. But now we are in a scenario where theories have become so many. Because this one says this one gives this one gives that, this one gives the other. So the theories have ended up conflicting one another. Not a single theory agrees with another. History bears as witness that no single theory that has not been conflicted. When we reach here, this is where now the question comes in. So where do we go? Where do we go? Maths, which was the surest, considered as the surest of the sciences, lost that direction when the Euclidean mathematics was displaced by other forms of mathematics. So they realized that after all, what we have been assuming as certain is not certain. Physics reached a fix where they could now not even understand what exactly is the nature of reality. So still today, physics is in a shock. The shock that it is in is the discovery that reality exists in twofold nature. On one side, it looks like a wave, and on another side, it looks like a particle.
Thank you. Thank you, Doctor. Now, we are running short of time, and we are on the very edges of the time we would have to have this event. Now, just to be fair to the attendees now, let us not ask questions now, but say what we have captured from the presentation, or if we can leave a query just for the other time when we meet, maybe. Of course, we're going to give the doctor another chance when you open the university. When the university opens, hope he is going to have the first presentation so that we can finish up the remaining part of the methodology. Now, let's start. Of course, we shall, because we may introduce ourselves and go straight to say something we grasp. Maybe to be fair to my brother, I hope, because he was in a group and asked this question, Kashumba, can you try to translate in few words kwa Kiswahili, mtu anayejitambua, kujitambua ni nini na anayejitambua yukoje? Kind of, mimi nilivyoelewa ni yule ambaye anajua, sio tu anaona kinachoendelea, bali anajiuliza, anajishughulisha na mchakato wa kwa nini kilichopo kiko vile. So huyo mtu anajitambua, anaelewa. Sasa tuanzie kwa moja kwa moja. Ningependa kwa Kiswahili kama unaweza, alafu straight to something you grasped from the presentation, then it comes out.
Hauko mbali na namna niliyoelewa, na ni swali ambalo mimi mwenyewe ningeuliza.
Okay.
Kwa ufupi nilichopata hapa, maana ya self awareness according to doctor's explanation, kama ulivyosema, sio tu kutenda jambo au sio tu kujihusisha na jambo fulani, bali kurudi ndani, kurudi katika akili ya binadamu na kutaka kutambua kwamba katika akili ya binadamu kuna vipengele vipi ambavyo vinachochea katika ufahamu huo wa binadamu au kuelewa kwa binadamu. Sasa kwa yule anayejibidisha katika kurudi huko ndani na kutaka kuelewa ndani ya akili ya binadamu kuna yapi yanayoendelea na yanachocheaje uelewa au ufahamu wa mambo kadha wa kadha, unaweza basi ukasema ya kwamba mtu huyu yupo katika hatua hiyo ya self awareness au kujitambua, unaweza ukasema. Yes. Sasa what I understood from doctor's presentation is an interesting presentation, and I am anxiously anticipating the follow-up. Yes. Sasa I liked the flow from logic to method to the subject, from logic to method to the subject. How I wish we had more time ili doctor angetueleza zaidi hapa ile naita dialectical flow ya kwamba tumeanza logic. What was the challenge, the single challenge that led to the movement into method? Nimeelewa kwa method ya kwamba aliongelea kulikuwa kuna various methods. Sasa tunachanganyikiwa kama ziko nyingi, ni ipi inayofaa? Sasa kwa kusudi la changamoto hiyo ikachochea kujiuliza, so where do we move next? And the proposed foundation now is the subject, how self knowledge kama anavyosema daktari hapa. Kwa hiyo kwangu mimi nimependa hiyo flow, na possibly some other time if you get enough time I would really want to understand hiyo flow ya kwamba there was a thesis, logic is the foundation. Okay, in logic what was the antithesis that led to a new thesis, or the synthesis? Okay, in method, and do your new thesis sasa. So what was the antithesis to that? Which led to a new thesis, which is the subject. And possibly ndio atatuambia next time ya kwamba anaonaje, is this subject enduring? Is it an enduring foundation, or we also should leave room to expect another foundation for philosophy and science as well?
Thank you very much. Asante sana. Karibu. Jina?
Kwa majina inaitwa Patrick Mswazi. Basi kutokana na mada iliyozungumziwa kwamba nikianza kabisa juu ya ufahamu wangu wa kujitambua, naangalia uwiano kwamba kutambua yaliyo ya nje na kutambua yaliyo ndani yangu mimi mwenyewe, kwamba tunahaswa kwamba tuzingatie yale yaliyo ya ndani, kwamba kujitambua zaidi kwa ndani mimi itanifanya kunisukuma mimi kufanyaje, kutambua yale ya nje. Tukiangalia mfano kwa mnyama anazingatia sana yaliyo nje, sio yale ya ndani. Kwamba yale ya nje akimaliza, kinachomfanya baadaye kinachokuja ni kulala. Kwa sisi binadamu kwamba tuanze ndani, kwamba tuzingatie sana yale ya ndani, tusukume kuelewa yale ya nje. Ndio maana kwenye agenda ambayo amezungumzia Dr. hapa ameongelea the influence of phenomenology, the influence of phenomenology on self knowledge. He spoke about intentionality, about the conscious experience in nature. That is what the point I just from.
Thank you very much. There should be many, but at least that one, in the way you made it from. Karibu.
Asante. Naitwa Loirita. Naomba nianze na point ya kwamba kujitambua maana yake ni nini, lakini pia sifa za mtu anayejitambua. Kwanza tutambue kwamba katika viumbe vyote ambavyo vipo hai, binadamu pekee ndio kiumbe ambaye ana ule upeo wa kujitambua. Na kujitambua ni mchakato kama alivyosema daktari, ni mchakato, lakini pia ni mchakato unaohusisha maarifa ya mtu kutambua hali ya nafsi yake ya ndani, nikiwa na maana kujua uwezo wake ni nini, upeo wake ni nini, lakini pia nini anaweza kukifanya. Na pia kwa sababu ni mchakato, inamhusisha pia mtu kutambua ya kwamba nini siwezi kufanya kulingana na mazingira aliyoko. Ni wazi kwamba sasa hivi kwa hali ya haraka tu, kwa mfano, yaani ni vigumu sasa hivi kwa mazingira tuliyoko hapa mtu kwenda labda na kufanya haja ndogo pale, kwa sababu utakuwa umepoteza utambuzi wako wa mazingira ulioko pamoja pia na the self ama nafsi yako. Sasa sifa ya mtu anayejitambua siwezi kutaja nyingi, lakini mara nyingi anatambua mazingira aliyoko yana demand nini kutoka kwake, kwa sababu tayari yuko na ile consciousness ya kujua kwamba mimi ni nani, natakiwa nifanye nini. Hiyo mimi ndo naona kwa mtazamo wangu. Lakini pia nilichopenda kwa presentation na nilielewa na nilipenda theory ya constructivism. Sababu ni kwamba bado sina theory, lakini nilikuwa naona kama people can construct their own ideas. I believe, na aliongelea with the link of science, kwamba constructivism ni kwamba to me nilijaribu kutranslate on my own kwamba kama constructivism ipo and is a possible thing, then we are not the victim of situation ama circumstance. Kwa hiyo I still now go back, sijui kama atakuwa na oppose au it might be a question for the next time, kwamba sasa kwa nini kuna objectivism if people can come up with their own idea, they can construct their own idea depending on the situation, because constructivism mean you cannot be the victim of the circumstance. Kwa hiyo nimeelewa na nimependa hiyo sana.
Asante. Katika conclude haya yote nashukuru sana. Nitamwachia Dr. nafasi ya kusema neno la mwisho. Baada ya hapo
Thank you. And I was going to ask you for that. Actually, I'll tell you just one word.
Okay.
That paradoxically,
yes,
you will oppose me and you will be opposed to my views, but implicitly you will acknowledge it. If you at all believe that we need critical thinkers, then you are in line with what I am saying. The world acknowledges that we need critical thinkers. In education sector, they are saying what we are lacking are critical thinkers. This is exactly what we mean. So Socrates akaiweka, know thyself. Kant akaiweka, think for yourself. Lonegan akaiweka, self-appropriation. One and the same thing, which we all subscribe to, but we have not yet conscientized ourselves what it means. It means precisely what I am proposing, the self-awareness.
Thank you very much. We are going to have more episodes in the holidays, but also when you open, you hope to have the doctor again for the finish up. Thank you very much. See you next time.
Thank you. Thank you.